We're recording.
Okay.
We're recording.
Right, we'll go quickly in the remaining time. Slightly overrunning, possibly. The use commune, which we'll deal with now. Okay, I know how to do this. Now, I've just got an overshot. I've got an overshot on this. So we should actually be on what is the use commune. So let's try and get back to where we should be. There we are. Okay, so the use commune, when we use it here, is common law, but it means, in this sense, essentially what was historically seen as the law that the civilized world had in common, which was, they saw Roman law, that it had some relevance wherever you were, because when you have the Renaissance, and the Renaissance starts earlier than the Italians and Michelangelo and Donatello and the other turtles. It starts you start moving out of the so-called Dark Ages much earlier than that. There's something called the Little Renaissance, I think, which is the sort of 12th, 13th century, as learning begins to come back essentially to Western Europe. The rediscovery of Aristotle and the ancients, and you move on to a period where the greater minds were trying to find as many ancient texts as they possibly could, because these were seen as being the work of great civilization and where the true highest knowledge, highest secular knowledge, was to be found. I mean, we often think in terms of, in the modern day, in terms of the church being a force against the Renaissance and the growth of learning, but it was actually, in those days, tended to be only the clergymen who could read, so it never would have got off the ground without them. And indeed, there were various popes who were known for searching the length and breadth of Italy to try and find ancient Roman texts, and often they would find these as like the underwriting on manuscripts, because the lack of paper, particularly after the Islamic invasion of Egypt, there's a lack of paper in the West, so things would be written on manuscript, and they would have to be overwritten, and because you had little manuscripts, it was very hard to produce. The monks would have to make choices as to what they were going to essentially rub out and write something new. But fortunately, it was possible to try and find out what was written before. And I think some of the ancient Romans that we have their works for is because they were essentially been written over about 4 or 5 times, but could nevertheless be even in the old days before computers, they could find out what had been written there. So Roman law was particularly codified by Justinian. Now Justinian is an emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire. He produced his digest and code, which said this is Roman law because Ulpian or Paulus or Gaius, and there's another 2 I can't quite remember, had said it, therefore it must be right. And these rules came to be used in the southern part of Europe. Roman law continued to be used there. And as I said earlier, it was a more sophisticated system. Roman law could cope with futures contracts. The ancient customary law of Normandy, as you would find it in the two Coutumiers, didn't even know anything about contract law. So, what happens? Well, again, keep on coming back to this. If a coutume does not cover the point, then you consider local usage. If you don't have local usage, you consider neighbouring customary law territories. And if you don't, then you look to Roman law. This is Routier. He's essentially rationalising the process from an 18th century point. Now, by the 18th century, most of what we know as sort of Greek and Roman texts have been discovered. Everyone is terribly learned in it. The nobility are reading and writing again instead of just punching each other in the face and going off and fighting crusades. It's no longer just the clergy, but so it doesn't really tell you what the process was whereby Roman law came back into Norman law, and the answer to that is simply what is put here, that in the 13th century, people who were the more sophisticated, the more cultivated people, those who could actually read or write, in other words, were taking an interest in Roman texts. And because you have a vacuum in certain areas of customary law, everyone says, well, this is great, we will use these texts, this better law. Okay, we're going to hold true to our customs, but we can now have the Paris fashions of law in these particular areas. And as Kelleher puts, and he's just in this essentially talking about what Jean Yver said, Roman law spread quickly in Normandy in the 13th century and persuaded those of cultivated minds all the faster because it did so in a vacuum. So if we go back to our, why did we start at 58 BC? Because the whole of this area is a Roman law area. Now, Roman law receded, and here is the return of Roman law, washing back into Northern Europe, as Northern Europe becomes more civilized, more cultivated, just as it had receded as the Franks went bashing their way through the traces of Roman civilization. Now this is interesting, Mr. Hoare. Why is this interesting? Now, it's not so much because he says Roman law should be restricted to the ecclesiastical courts, but because one of the grand themes of the Rome of customary law is not just the assimilation of outside material, but with that comes the inevitable tension of, are you going too far? It's like with purposive interpretation of statutes. It's all well and good, and we all feel terribly enabled, when we can, look at Hansard under Pepper and Hart. But then you have the question of, why are you going too far? And are you actually beginning to leave behind the real, proper, undoubted law of statute? And here, people would always begin to worry, if Roman law is terribly fashionable, but are you applying it out of place? Are you beginning to apply it in place of the local law? Just as you have controversies, for example, in the area of contract, both in Guernsey and in Jersey, are you beginning to like the idea of bringing in English contract law so much that you're absolutely forgetting about that there's already a local system there? So there's the risk that Roman law is not just entering into a vacuum, but muscling out existing law which has worked perfectly well, so doesn't necessarily need to be muscled out, and also creating a period of doubt and uncertainty as two rival systems begin to fight it out with different fight it out in the courts, where what really matters is not so much what the law is, but whether you have a judge who's inclined to be conservative or liberal in these matters. And you have a quote from Benet Pipon, which is a Privy Council appeal from Jersey, but what it says could equally have been said about Guernsey, that Roman law comes into the Channel Islands, really, via the law of Normandy. You don't leap backwards directly into Justinian. You essentially have something which has been a source of Norman law, which is now filtering through into Channel Island law, into Guernsey law or Jersey law, as appropriate. So think of layers upon layers. And the reason why I did this in this way is to highlight that when you get to the modern era, the Roman law as it entered Norman law, and then entered Guernsey law, developed in Guernsey. What's below it is being obscured. You have several iterations, several layers of legal history before you eventually get back to Roman law itself. So you can't just unwind the development in Guernsey to get back to Roman law in any pure sense. You can't get back to Roman law missing out Norman law. Because if you've got a complete absence of other legal sources, the chances are that we're going to leap to looking to English common law and doing a comparative analysis of various foreign laws rather than leaping back 2,000 years. I mean, Roman law, and this is again the reason for dealing with the history, Roman law as a direct source into Guernsey customary law didn't exist because it had been wiped out from Northern Europe. It exists as a source that becomes relevant through the Renaissance and through Normandy and then back into Guernsey. So what you need to know is Doma, in terms of the names of the commentators you particularly need to know about civil law, although I think Pardasus, I think this is where I should put Pardasus and Fornell.
Where what?
Pardasus and Fornell, they should be on this slide rather than on the other one, shouldn't they?
Yes.
Okay.
Or Kosovo.
But having put them there in the study guide, I'll probably miss that. Move it around next time. It doesn't matter too much, but they are commentators. But they're commentators on the Code Civil on areas which are customary law, so they don't really fit here either, do they?
No, I have a sort of Code Civil section one day.
Yeah. Well, okay. So Doma he's very important, wrote in the 17th century. If you put his name into Bailey, he'll come up a lot in the Scottish courts, but not really since the 19th century. And the reason for this is it's like the basic way in which things work is that the more cases you get, the more the ultimate source is obscured, and that's true in customary law. It's true, actually, it can be true, for example, in statutes. When you're a student and you have to answer a question to do with a statute, you always start with a statute. But if you've got a question on the Offences Against the Person Act, you're really answering a question on the cases that are built up over the years. You very rarely, in any meaningful sense, analyse the particular words. It's the cases that matter. So, in Scotland, lots of cases, well, Jersey at least, or Guernsey at least, mean that Doma has become obscured. He's no longer really cited. That's not because his ideas are no longer accurate, it's because there's lots of cases representing the ideas. His ideas have been assimilated and he's been cast aside like a husk. It's a bit like I don't know, Cybermen or the Borg or something like that. It's like he's no longer important because he's been so well assimilated. Now, it's cited in Guernsey, Paulding and Elliot, flight lists. If this was Jersey, loads of citations. He is one of the two people who we have direct quotes from put in the contract paper. Most of them from Poitiers, but some of them are from Doma. And he's a big name there, much less so here. Poitiers. Poitiers actually was, to some extent, of foundational importance in modern English contract law. Very widely cited in Scotland still. If you were a Scottish lawyer, you'd probably have your copies. Scottish contract lawyer, you want your copies of Poitiers. Cited in the UK Supreme Court recently. And he's the basis of much of the Code of Napoleon, because although Napoleon got rid of customary law, he got rid of everything that previously existed, because the whole idea of the French Revolution, or one of the ideas of the French Revolution, was to create one France. To move away from the position where it was just where you were tied to particular communities within it. So you no longer had different jurisdictions within France. It was to be a single country. But it didn't create an entirely new legal system, because there's no point in doing that. You build on what's gone before, even if you're Napoleon. So Poitiers in the Guernsey court, many more citations. The Duputron and Duputron case at the bottom is useful because it shows what's often the legal reasoning, the Guernsey legal reasoning method, which is the same as the Jersey legal reasoning method, to jump tracks, effectively. Because if you can say that the fundamental principles of Potier are the same as the fundamental principles of English case law, you can then say, well, now we'll look at the English case law on those principles. You could equally say, now we'll look at the French civil code. And then, of course, actually, if you carry on doing that, and you might very well lose sight of Potier altogether, and not notice when the English actually change their principles. Now, interesting in Jersey, because it's got the analysis exists in there, much cited thing, John Kelleher showing that, at least as of 1998, that 50% of reported Jersey contract cases cited Potier. Surest guide. It would be the surest guide to some extent in Guernsey, except Guernsey's kind of lost its way. It doesn't really know what its law of contract
We've
is.
lost our way.
In contract. But this is what the St. John Robillard article
He's right. I mean, what is Guernsey contract law? You know, as a matter of principle, it should be Potier, it should be like Jersey. I think Jersey's gone too French for its own commercials. Good. But English contract, Guernsey contract law should properly be Potier. And Potier is still very readable. And of course was the basis, you know, when Atkin and Chitty were writing their first text, they also borrowed from Potier. So you tend to get the same result, whether you look at Potier, the French tradition, or the English tradition. And we have no statutes, of course. We don't even have sale of goods. You've at least got sale of goods legislation in Jersey. We haven't got that. So I think Potier is still very relevant, and of course underpins the Code Civil as well. So he's an excellent.
I mean, not jumping forward a little bit, but when Gordon said, you know, Jersey can end up being too French in terms of contract for its own good, because it's almost like there's a need for two laws of contract, because on the one hand, both islands are small communities and the ordinary dealings between people are not the dealings of major corporates. On the other hand, it's a major finance centre, so the contracts need to have the sort of certainty that those sort of businesses require, and those sort of businesses are staffed by people who have often come from England or have worked in England or being trained by people from England or using standard contracts which are drafted in England. This is a point made in the case called Toothill from Jersey by Sir Michael Burt, dealing with the question of how should a bank deal with a situation where you have husband and wife, and the wife's being asked to guarantee a loan to the husband on the property. Common problem in England and Wales about undue influence. And it's recognised that the reality is that these banks are institutions which are like the English institutions, which would naturally veer themselves towards following the codes of practice and the best behaviour that have grown up in England. It's potentially a bit inconvenient to try and invent an entirely different approach to it because we want to have a separate contract law. So that's the reason why there's a pull. And again, it's a pull in terms almost of usage. People want to use contracts which have been drafted in England or methods that have been adopted in England, and they want them to have the same results. And they don't necessarily want, for purely conservative legal reasons, for those methods to be frustrated. So in a way, it still can be rationalised in terms of customary law and the way in which customary law adapts to the to new circumstances.
Yes, good point.
So we then have lots of quotations about how Roman law can be relevant, and Vallier and Hammond says, well, it's just very different. There may be general similarities, and parts may have come to it through various parts of French law and the Code Napoleon, but the similarity is too general and approximate in character to be of much assistance in a particular case. Now, Snell and Beadle is an example of a case where actually they did, trace the rule all the way back to its Roman roots in order to decide the question of. This was all to do with the principle of if you sell land, it's true in Jersey and in Guernsey, and you sell it for under half its value, you can rescind the contract. And this was whether or not that applied to essentially rights over land as servitude, essentially because this was somebody who needed access to his house. And he had excellent relations with his neighbour until she discovered that actually she might have a way of getting more money out of him. At which it goes all the way up to the Privy Council, so that really makes a great deal of sense for everybody concerned. So she lost, and doubtless lost a lot of money. Or did she win? I can't remember. But anyway, everyone loses. Everyone loses apart from the lawyers. That's the main thing to know. But in that case, they did actually manage to. They did because they could trace it down all through those steps to the Roman law roots. The Roman law was relevant and maybe even potentially determinative. I think Lord Roger's in that case, though, isn't he? Snell and Beadle, Lord Roger? It might have been Lord Roger, because there's certainly. Yeah, but he was a big expert on Roman law. And Lord Hope was certainly in it, and obviously he's Scottish, and they've got much more contact with Roman law.
Was very that through his South African roots was very immersed in Roman law.
You know, there was one House of Lords case, at least one, where there was a majority of the judges were South African.
Oh gosh.
Yeah. So Southwell, who's one of the, said earlier, is judge of the Jersey and Guernsey Court of Appeal, here he's sitting in the Guernsey Court of Appeal, and saying it's usually pointless to go back to Roman roots. Now, so I'll just end on that particular. Just go back.
Sorry, if he's saying that it's pointless to go back.
Usually pointless. Because Snell and Beadle, it wasn't pointless. So the basic point here, which is the point made in the study guide, is that you can't get an argument off the ground by starting with your copy of Justinian or Gaius and working your way forward. You may have points where there's a sufficient lack of clarity, and that's where lawyers really earn their work, where they are artists rather than technicians, is when you work your way back, say, well, what is the rule here? And each step, you don't really get to a firm, clear answer. It may be that the historic Roman roots become relevant, that you actually is right to go down through all those layers. Normally, it won't be. Normally, the fact of the matter is that Roman law had swept north into Norman customary law, been adopted in a particular way, been written about by Norman writers, that Guernsey writers had then adopted that and it had been applied, and then there'll be cases maybe on it, in which case you don't care what Gaius said. On the other hand, if you have a really unusual problem approached for the first time that no one's actually ever given the answer to, you might be, as in Snell and Beadle, you might plod your way down through and you're looking legitimately at some of the more original Roman sources. But don't forget that adjudication has to be a containable process. A court case has to last a finite and reasonably proportionate amount of time, which means that whereas we'll go through a lot of sources which are potentially relevant, most of them aren't relevant in any particular case. Just as you will have, there's a personal injury case in the 1990s which was on whether the common law recognised an action for an injury done to an unborn baby, and it overturned the previous English common law rule, and it did so by reference to a state of Victoria case, I think, which referred to a Quebec case, Quebec actually obviously not being common law, which, and that case drew from the very distant past. So you have a case there where you're looking at some extraordinarily broad array of sources which aren't usually relevant. But because you're trying to get an excuse to overturn a really stupid and unjust rule, you bring them in. It gives you the footing to actually go on. So just as persuasive sources for English law include other common law jurisdictions. They can include looking at the German law of tort and whether or not it causes problems in White and Jones. It can include, as in Kleinwort Benson, looking at legislative reform to say, well, the rest of the world thinks this idea is a stupid idea, let's change it ourselves without legislation. All those things are possible, but those sources aren't usually relevant, but it's about knowing and being able to spot and have an idea of when they might be right. Now, I think I might... See, this rather randomly turns up on this particular table, but this is the Jersey analysis of when things are relevant, when different cases have been cited. It's useful because it shows that sometimes actually these things are not cited all the time, but it does show perhaps the relative importance in customary law areas. It would be different if it was in Guernsey, because there are areas where Guernsey has legislated away the customary law, for example in areas of rights of succession. Anyway, let's not do the questions because actually we are over time, I think, already.
Yes, I suppose.
Unless Gordon can answer them very quickly for us.
Well, we've got a reference to Jersey law, so it should be Guernsey law, but we'll let that go. Potier, for me, Potier's contract. He also wrote treaties on partnership, but we've got a partnership legislation. But you could conceive of that. He wrote treaties on law of sale. You might look at sale, a contract sale of the Potier. Why is this? And yes, they nicked chunks of Potier and put them directly into the Code Civil. I've got a edition of Potier that has a concordance at the end where you can find the chapter, what paragraph of the article of the Code Civil relates to which chunk of Potier. It's that. Literally, you can read off where to find Potier copied into the Code Civil. It's quite
well, we cited Potier in the law officers on damages in tort.
In this case, just this is the damages case for sexual abuse. The brother and sister, or
I don't know the details of the case.
Yeah,
I didn't need to know, and I didn't want to know.
Enormous damages, and you're defending that and saying it shouldn't be.
Well, no. I could only really talk about what's clearly in the court. But we intervened, and the AG intervened to argue not that it should, not that an order for periodical payments should be made or how much it should be made, but that there was jurisdiction in the court to consider it, which was something that the judge had asked to be addressed on. And so one of the arguments was to look at Potier and say, well, his rule on obligations is exactly the same as on damages, exactly the same as the fundamental principles of English common law. It's still there in the Code Civil, absolutely unchanged. Thank you, Mr. Dawes. We took that straight from your book. And then we tiptoe off to Duncan Fairgrieve, who's the he's not teaching contract now in Jersey. Okay. He's the one of the I think he's the director of the Comparative Law Institute, and has written on this subject. And we say, could you please, we ask him, are there any French cases on this particular? So essentially, the cases on the Code Civil then become relevant. Whether it leads to us getting the result we seek is another matter. But it does show that if you can make a link between Potier and modern relevant English law, and then you can show the same link between Potier and the Code Civil, you can then start trying to bring in French jurisprudence on the Code Civil. But you're always, in this, you're with any sort of foreign source, and by foreign source we mean non-Guernsey source, you're always having to put in your argument for why it's relevant. And that argument might be as simple as, we're doing this on a comparative law basis, we're just looking at comparable jurisdictions because we had nothing here. Or it could be something more solid and tangible.
That's why we come back to the roadmap.
The roadmap.
Which way are we going? Is it customary, civil law, common law? So you need to know where you're going.
Yeah, because you don't really have to, except in the most formal sense of ticking a box in an exam question, you don't really have to show why you're citing an English case on negligence in an action for tort. If you're going to try and jump tracks into citing something which is Code Civil, and you've got to show why you're permitted to jump tracks, and that's actually quite a big ask. Because otherwise you could be citing, the court could be there for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks as it listens to a whole load of tangentially relevant or utterly irrelevant material.
So the next one, Routier. We don't use Routier much, but he does give this wonderful short demonstration of describing and defining custom law, so that's worth looking at. I don't know what Routier is.
It basically,
Roman law.
so you use the rationale of Roman law when you run out of custom
yes,
sources.
it was Rule 17 or something like that. Yeah.
And is Roman law, as Southwell said, too remote to be interesting? It's usually, we just dealt with that. It's usually great for legal historians, and you're more likely to be wasting your time. It's a bit like Pepper and Hart. If you ever find yourself really needing to look at Pepper and Hart and Hansard to try and construe a statute, you're probably wasting your time. You'll almost certainly find nothing that fits within the actual criteria, and even if you do, you'll probably still lose.
There's a lot of Roman law there. Now, Terrain is forever citing Roman law. So through l'approbation, a lot of Roman law slips in because Terrain is influenced by it, and Potier is enormously influenced by Roman law too. So
But you read.
But do you not have to go back because
you're not calling it Roman law. There's a lot of Roman law there without being identifiable anymore, which is Dennis's point, that you've lost that identity, but it's still there because that's the legal history of this part of the world.
I mean, if you go back, if you look in a 16th or 17th century case report from England, you'll often find various commentators from continental Europe being cited, people like Grotius and the like, in a way which wouldn't be legitimate nowadays, and they perhaps informed the development of law and then fallen by the wayside because there's more than enough cases to be getting on with it.
Yeah. The first page we opened reference to Papon, so just random openings.
Papinian, he's one of the ones I forgot.
So,
Okay, I shall see you.
tomorrow.
You're convening at what time tomorrow?
10.
Is it 10?